After working through more than 10 hours at double speed of critiques of Heiser, especially those focused on the divine counsel, I found that most of the objections fall into two main categories. So the first category, though weak, is the only one that I feel like could even land as a critique, because it ultimately boils down to opinion. It centers on hermeneutics, and it usually takes the form of Heiser lets the ancient Near Eastern material influence his exegesis too much, or something like that. But that's a subjective criticism, and it often reduces to simple question begging. Everyone, up to a point at least, allows cultural context to inform their exegesis. So a good example would be the 10 plagues of Egypt. Any solid commentary is going to know how each plague corresponds to or undermines specific Egyptian deities. But recognizing that requires knowing something about those deities, knowledge that modern readers in the low context society generally lack. By contrast, in the high context society that the ancient world, the biblical text would have emerged out of, that background information would have been far more familiar and just assumed. Another example we could give is like the image of God. It's a concept that isn't unique to the Bible. Many ancient cultures had, in fact, basically every culture had it. What was distinct, though, was this. So in the Egyptian religion, for example, the person made in the image of Ra or whoever the high god was at the time would be Pharaoh. If you're some random peasant farmer, sucks for you, but you're not made in the image of Ra. Only the elites are, basically. And so that's not the case in the biblical narrative. Genesis says that all humans, male and female, are made in God's image. It's deliberately engaging with this well-known cultural concept of representing a deity. The difference is everyone represents the true God as his agent, as his representative. To echo Paul, there's neither slave nor free, no male and female, neither Jew nor Gentile. Everyone is God's representative. Now, examples like this could be multiplied exponentially, but the point is that the broader cultural background routinely helps us understand Scripture. And we already accept that in many cases. The question, of course, is to what degree do we allow that? How far is too far, etc.? But like I said, it's a sliding scale that's subjective, which is why it often reduces to question begging. You don't take things in context. No, you don't take things into context because you're ignoring the ancient Near Eastern context that the inspired authors actually lived in. As I recall, Jordan Cooper's critique was more or less this on the hermeneutic issue, which is probably why I didn't even bother to interact with it, because I feel like it's question begging at the end of the day. And as weak as that critique is, I feel like even worse is the second criticism you come across. And it revolves around the big problem of getting hung up on the English, specifically the term God, and especially when you put an S at the end of it, gods. Now, I wrote these quotes down verbatim, and these are critics of the Divine Counsel of Heiser. And this is Fred Butler in a video with Justin Peters. He states, quote, he tries to give the impression that Jews believe that these were divine beings. You read any kind of, ancient Jewish literature and theology, they understood the Elohim to be angels. Now, a Christian road warrior in a different separate rebuttal video that I responded to, quote, now there are demons, according to the Bible, evil spirits, and there are angels, the good guys, but they're not gods. Now, anyone familiar with Heiser's work, or even just the way the Bible uses Elohim, you can immediately spot the problem here. So let's plug in some Hebrew terms into their quotes, and you'll see quickly the problem here. So he says, Heiser tries to give the impression that Jews believe that these were divine beings. Now, because Butler never defines his terms, I don't know what, if any, Hebrew term he believes would mean divine beings. Personally, I think Elohim would be actually a really good, accurate term for that, but that would actually just prove my point. Because as he himself acknowledges, a number of things get called Elohim. So from his perspective, I guess there's no functional Hebrew term that means just divine beings generically. But like I said, I think Elohim would be that. But continuing with his quote, this is where things get demonstrably wrong. And remember, I'm plugging in the Hebrew words for the English. You read any kind of ancient Jewish literature and theology, they understood the Elohim to be Malachim. Now, this is just sloppy, and the Christian road warrior quote is similar. Now, there are Shadim, according to the Bible, evil spirits, and there are Malachim, the good guys, but they're not Elohim. Now, the reason this is so sloppy is because, okay, first off, Malachim, it simply means messenger. It's a job description. There are human Malachim. God himself delivers messages and is called the Malach Yahweh, the angel of the Lord. But if you go to a passage like Exodus 15:11, it doesn't say who is like Yahweh among the Malachim. No, it says who is like Yahweh among the Elohim, among the gods. Psalm 96:4. Now I'm picking that one specifically for a reason. Great is Yahweh and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all Elohim. Again, it doesn't say Malachim, messengers, angels. It says Elohim, gods. Now, I chose that one specifically because the next verse, it says, the Elohim of the peoples are worthless idols, but Yahweh made the heavens. Now, here's where the other side would say, see, there's nothing to see here. The scare quotes gods are nothing more than idols humans have made. Now, on one hand, that's kind of true. I mean, Paul in 1 Corinthians 8 says an idol has no real existence. So sure, the physical object is nothing. But St. Paul, same letter, 2 chapters later, he says, what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I did not want you to be participants with demons. Now, most Bibles will have some kind of indication here that Paul is citing Deuteronomy 32:17. Now, simply put, the idol, the object itself, is nothing. But attached to that object are spirits. It's through this lens, I think, that we need to understand statements like the gods of the nations are idols in Psalm 96:5. Because, in fact, in the LXX, in the Greek, it's in perfect agreement with what I'm saying. It says, for all the gods of the nations are demons. So it's not as if they don't exist. It's no, there are actual spiritual entities attached to them. But here the critic might say, but see, it's calling them demons. Yes, I can't emphasize this point enough. The Psalm, along with Deuteronomy 32:17, calls them theos, gods, and then it calls them demons. Or in Hebrew, it calls them shedim, then Elohim. So simply put, the biblical text has no problem calling them by the terms the critics of Heiser object to. Heiser was simply stating the obvious. Another example I could use is in Psalm 86:8. There is none like you among the gods, among the Elohim. In the Greek, same thing. There is none like you among the theos, O Lord. This is why I took issue with Henning's argument that Heiser was a polytheist. Because if you break down the word, poly means more than one, theos, God. So therefore, if you have poly, more than one God, and Heiser saying that the other gods are actually real entities, then therefore, tada, Heiser's a polytheist. But hopefully, you can already see why this is such a problem. By that silly, simplistic definition, the Bible is polytheistic because you have other Elohim and other theos running around. So, good job. You just condemned the Bible. So, that's another pet peeve of mine, by the way, is these debates about monotheism and polytheism. These are Enlightenment discussions. Cambridge Platonists imposing modern labels onto ancient texts. Even worse, they did this back before Egyptian and Ugaritic material was even really known about. They didn't decipher hieroglyphs and cuneiform until like the mid 1800s, and it wouldn't be until about World War I would have been when you had the Rosh Hashanah text would have been discovered. Of course, that doesn't start getting translated and actually disseminated until more like World War II. But the point is, they just didn't have the context for a lot of this stuff when they were having those discussions about monotheism, polytheism. And again, these are people having totally different discussions and then taking that filter and smashing it on top of the Bible and then making that the standard of orthodoxy, which is just nonsensical to me. Now, part of the irony is while Heiser gets lumped in with these so-called liberal scholars, it's the critics that share some of the same logic. Now, I'll explain. So the liberal logic is that Israelite religion started polytheistic, and somewhere, it's usually the exile is going to be kind of like the pivot point. It evolves into monotheism, maybe with like monolatry and henotheism briefly preceding that period. Now, Heiser's critics, and here I mean people like Justin Peters, and Jordan Cooper, people like that. They'll say that Israel was always monotheistic. Now, okay, that's great, but what does that even mean? We've already seen the Bible is polytheistic. It's poly-elohimistic. So if your definition of monotheism is simply only one Elohim or theos exists, you've just denied angels and demons and a spiritual afterlife. Okay, 1 Samuel 28:13. Well, we don't want to do that. Well, so what do we do? This is why Heiser said, just junk the labels, focus on what the biblical text actually says. To quote Paul here, indeed, there are many lords and many gods, but for us, there's one. Only one Elohim gets described of as the uncreated creator, sovereign by his very nature. Yahweh is not capital God, God, by virtue of a single term that's applied to him, because that term, Elohim or Theos, it gets applied to several other entities. Yahweh is God of gods by his very nature. We know this by the way he's described, by his unique ways, his unique deeds that he does that no other Elohim does. So I've used this human example. Man, American citizen, son, brother, I could probably extend the list, but those words describe me, they describe a lot of other people, and they describe the current US president. But that terminological overlap doesn't make me the president. Literally no one would make that mistake. Yet that is precisely what Heiser's critics and the liberal scholars do. Other Elohim actually existing must mean polytheism. No. Simply look at the way the term is actually being used in the biblical text. Now, here's an example I'm going to show you of the liberal scholars burying their head in the sand. So this is out of Heiser's Angels book, and this is page 79. And he writes, many scholars believe, in context, is talking about the increase of the use of the term angelos and the LXX, and you could also loop in the New Testament as well. But he says, many scholars believe that this increase indicates a rejection of divine plurality as part of the theological evolution out of polytheism toward a rigid, intolerant monotheism. The idea is basically assumed by scholars who write about Second Temple period angelology. And he continues on with the quote, with a footnote that I want to get to. But I guess I need to break in here a little bit just to kind of lay this out, because the point is making is that, again, the liberal scholars have this idea that you had polytheism, and then because we see an increase in angel kind of language in the Greek translation as well as the New Testament era, that is proof of this evolution downward into monotheism, or away from polytheism, away from Elohim kind of language into monotheism. And this is Heiser's dissertation kind of topic. It's like, that really doesn't work. So here in the footnote, it's really interesting. So this is footnote 11, page 79. He says, for example, Carol Newsom interprets plural Elohim in the Dead Sea Scrolls as angelic, right? So this is funny. She basically creates a category that doesn't exist, because otherwise it undermines her whole thesis, or not. It's not just hers. It's just that whole paradigm of the evolution from polytheism to monotheism that's largely assumed by liberal scholarship, if you want to use the term. But this blows that up. So what does she do? Does she look at the plural Elohim all over the place in the Dead Sea Scrolls and say, wait a minute, this doesn't work with our thesis here, with our evolutionary model? No. She says, oh, they're angelic Elohim. She just creates this term. We'll skip over John J. Collins, though he does similar stuff, because I feel like really egregious is Michael Wise here, even though they're all doing the same thing. But Michael Wise devotes over 40 pages of analysis to how certain Qumran scrolls elevate the God of Israel above angels, even though none of the scrolls he discusses contains the term Malachim, angels, but rather other terms of divine plurality. That is just staggering, because again, that is just completely circular logic here. It's using this term for plural, quote unquote, gods, but I'm just going to smack in the concept of angels, because that's my assumption, is that they've been demoted to the status of angels. That's the assumption, and they're taken into the text. So what do we do here? The liberals, the actual liberals, believe this evolution from polytheism to monotheism occurred. The evidence is plural Elohim, Elim, in certain older texts, like Exodus 15:11, stuff like that. And then the alleged demotion of the Elohim to mere angels and demons in later texts. The problem, what Heiser's dissertation was about, is they continued to write about plural Elohim in divine council context into the triple digits. You also lack any kind of softening language where they say, oh, by the way, these Elohim are just angels. They never do that. So they were perfectly fine calling them Elohim. So Heiser's conclusion was the text always meant the same thing. It's a revolutionary idea. All the texts are internally coherent and non-contradictory. And for this, you have some of these evangelical types calling Heiser a liberal, or Henning saying Heiser out-liberaled the liberal scholars. He's a heretic for this. For what? Saying that what the Bible actually says and believing it's non-contradictory and Yahweh is the God of gods throughout the entirety of Scripture? That's just so frustrating to me. Just take Heiser's basic principle and let the text speak for itself. Okay, sure. Unless we deny angels and demons or Satan exist and a spiritual afterlife, there are other Elohim. Okay, got that. So I suppose the next question should be, how do we translate the word? Does it mean capital G-O-D God? I'd say no. Does it mean lowercase g gods? Sure, you could throw that in there. Some might have a problem. I actually think spirit might be the best translation. Capital S spirit when you're talking about Yahweh, and just spirit in general when you're talking about other Elohim. But you're never going to get translations on board with all of that because it's such a drastic change. So I think it's just simpler to understand Elohim, it's morphologically plural, and translate capital G God and lowercase g gods depending on context. And translations already currently do that. We're fine as long as we don't load attributes into lowercase, God gods or Elohim. There isn't an English word for uncreated creator that's omniscient, all the omni attributes, omni words. If there's an English term for that, maybe it's not even English, but Yahweh, Jesus, maybe. I mean, that's like all we really have. But we have no words to carry all that weight. It's when we try to make English carry a burden that it can't uphold, we run into these problems. And then we denigrate the legacy of a scholar and call him a heretic because we're sloppy with the English and the biblical text while accusing him of that crime. So it's just sad stuff. Anyway, this is what the criticisms devolve into. It's hermeneutics, which is very subjective, or the Elohim English God issue. But so far, we're just spinning our wheels in the mud, not really moving the conversation forward. And so for my money here, I need to see something acknowledging all of this and then launching the criticism moving forward. And I'm not seeing that. I'm sure this video will hit so many other future criticisms of Heiser's work. Like, I can already predict where they're going to go because it's like this. I mean, Heiser has a number of things in his actual published work that really addresses so many of the concerns that these people have. And so it's really unfortunate, but I thought I'd make a shorter version of these really long videos that I've made. But that's about all for this time, and I'll see you guys later.